Thanks, guys. Really appreciate being here. And what I thought I would do, just to give you some context to my background and story. And first, I have to apologize, coming off a bit of a cold, so expect a few coughs during the session, but hopefully we can all make it through it. So I wanted to, we have about a half an hour, 40 minutes together. How I wanted to structure it was give you probably 10 minutes on my background, my own journey as an entrepreneur, to give you some information of how I see the world and some of the things that have informed my thinking, and then focus in on one area, which is disruptive entrepreneurship, and really the idea of what makes an entrepreneur, and some areas and hopefully some insights that we found from some learnings from some other professors and some work that we've done at Columbia Business School that can hopefully guide some of your thinking as you think about your business plans, and more importantly, as we think about building the ecosystem here in India that really encourages a spirit of entrepreneurship across things, right? But because we have, a relatively small audience, small group, I want it to be very interactive. So anytime, raise your hand, shoot out a question. Let's just kind of keep it collaborative in that way. And just, to give you some background, I started my journey back in the mid-90s. I started identifying back in that time that the Indian youth market was going through some dynamic changes. And I secured all the rights to Marvel and DC Comics and, brought all of those great characters here in a number of different local languages, launching my first startup, which was really about printing and publishing magazines in the Indian market at that time. And I woke up one day and I saw while I was spending almost a decade of my life bringing the best of the West to the East was going to the West. Characters like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball Z were becoming household names around the world. And countries like Korea, China, and Japan had literally built billion-dollar industries around the character entertainment ecosystem. Pokemon alone sold over $40 billion worth of products around the world, more than the GDP of countries. And yet India, which had some of the greatest and mythic stories that the world had ever known, had not been a part of this $100 billion a year character entertainment space that was emerging. I also started to see that there were some macro trends that we started to see happening in the superhero kind of character entertainment space. They're always reflective of larger societal trends. And I think even as a great entrepreneur, every entrepreneur has to kind of look within, and the entrepreneurs I admire the most always try to capture the right moment at the right time. And character entertainment, any entertainment, is really about that. All the Western superheroes were really born of the atomic age, the fear of man versus science, radioactivity, the civil rights movement, all of these things, Spider-Man, Hulk, Iron Man, they all deal with this concept of science versus man and radiation in that way. When we looked at Japan, they dealt with a larger societal theme that they had, which was man versus nature. So all of the big stories, Godzilla, Akira, Princess Mononoke, all dealt with this theme that they felt that there was an imbalance happening with the Japanese culture and their environment and nature. So post-apocalyptic wastelands, radioactive monsters, all of those types of things were the reflection of their storytelling that played on those underlying psychological fears. And so what started asking, what's the story of our generation? What's the story we live in today? And it was clear to me that wherever we are in the world, the story of our generation is the story of globalization. Today's kids don't learn about world history in textbooks. They have friends around the world on Facebook. And the inter-exchange of digital technologies has made us a very global country today. And never since Alexander the Great opened up the spice trade have we seen so much of an inter-exchange of ideas moving at digital blazing speed. So it's a great time to look at that story of globalization, how it's shaping us, and how your startup, or any startup for that matter, is really playing to that. And that really gave me my spark. We pulled together a studio of artists, writers, creators all across India, and we gave them this galvanizing mission, which was help transform the perception of India from an outsourcer to a source when it comes to this space of character entertainment. Let's move away from creating the greatest back-end shops and coloring in Tinkerbell to kind of creating stories that can captivate the universe and captivate the world. We did one project years ago where we reinvented Spider-Man as an Indian boy growing up in Mumbai. Gives you a sense of the kind of craziness that we were involved in. Peter Parker became Pavitra Prabhakar, so, Mira Jane, and all of that. And obviously it was one of the first what we call transcreations of its time, which is how do you, again, look at globalization, look at taking content, and look at the inter-exchange of content in something that you can move across borders. One side note, if anyone's familiar with the Spider-Man film, you know that in the US, Peter Parker is often made fun of because he's a bookworm that studies too hard. But in India, studying hard and working hard is actually a good thing, right? So we had to think of something else to make our Peter Parker an outcast in his kind of respective culture. So we made him play on the societal issues of a village boy getting a scholarship into the city and kind of playing on those values. This led me to form Virgin Comics with Richard Branson, which essentially took the same concept of what we were doing, but took it on a global level. Recently renamed it Liquid Comics a couple of years back, but the mission is the same. We work with creators from the ground up, and we create intellectual properties that we launch across digital platforms around the world and take into films, games, animation, movies, and all of that. But it got me back to my heart of what I wanted to really do. And so about a year and a half ago, I moved back to India, and I started this company called Graphic India. And the mission is, large and short of it, is to spark this creative renaissance of character entertainment in the country. Everything we're doing is across digital. Obviously, television and film are going to be big parts of that, but we look at the digital ecosystem in India as a way that if you were building the Marvel of today, it would not only be about great characters and stories, it would be about that direct relationship that you can have with a digital audience to kind of engage with them and build those properties together. And the other thing we started looking at historically, as many of you are familiar with Amar Chitakatha and the kind of stories that I grew up with as a kid and really loved growing up and still love. But I felt that what we wanted to do was present India in a very different way. The Mahabharata was the first property we took on, probably the greatest of all stories, a story that's known by a billion people but still relatively unknown by billions more. This is our version of the Mahabharata, which we launched recently called 18 Days, where we brought in, again, East meets West, the writer of Batman, to work with our whole creative team out here. We launched it worldwide on digital platforms. And I always say the Greek myths have captivated the world. We're sitting on some of the greatest myths the world has ever known for thousands of years. Long before James Cameron created Avatar, we had the first blue-skinned guy with a bow and arrow, right? I mean, we're the country that defined myth. And it's time to go back and show the world that we can kind of bring myth to another level. So we launched that as a big digital series in partnership with YouTube, 4 million views all around the world, and people who had never even heard of the Mahabharata being engaged with it. So, led us to another property that we did recently called Chakra the Invincible. It's a property we created with Stan Lee. So Stan was the creator of Spider-Man, the Avengers, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, X-Men. And it was a collaboration to bring the greatest creator of the Western superhero to India to create his first Indian superhero. So Chakra's about a kid who creates an Iron Man type suit that activates the chakras of the body. So East meets West. We launched it on Cartoon Network, doing a number of films with them, and recently launched it worldwide on Angry Birds, the first video series that they released on the game itself. So it reached 25 million viewers within the first 3 months, all of which, 90% of which were outside of India. Again, showing the potential for India to not only create content that's very unique and engaging for India, but take it to the world in a very engaging way in this space. A lot of the stuff we're doing is getting some great attention right now, but we're just starting. So, hopefully, and I have a big bag here of comics that I'm going to circulate out for all of you guys, so hopefully you guys can help spread the word about our mission and what we're trying to do. But, it took me back, so my other hat is as a professor at Columbia Business School, I kind of look at the media industry on a macro level, and a lot of what I'm trying to figure out are where are the disruptive areas that we're seeing in media today. And the two biggest disruptive trends that we're seeing in media anywhere in the world are technology and globalization. Either one would have radically changed everything we know about how the media business is going to work over the next 5 years. But the fact that they're coming and feeding off each other so relentlessly right now means that we're going to have an exponential change that's coming very soon. The advent of black and white to color television, the advent of 3-act storytelling to something very different, a new act, a new emergence, a new way to relate with the consumer. And so, the quick, long, and short of it is that what we are seeing is that the lines between most businesses, and this comes, I think, from most disruptive startups, you're looking at things and you're saying, who are the entrenched players? And it's sort of a caveat of truth that most of the entrenched players used to have very big silos where they competed and controlled. Whether it was in films, television, games, it didn't matter. They were masters of those domains. But all of a sudden, those lines are breaking down, right? I mean, the common truth that we see, certainly in media, is that everyone wants to be in everyone's business. So game guys are making films, film guys are making games, everyone's making toys, everyone's online, everyone's moving into everyone else's business and landscape. The other is that not only does everyone want to be in everyone's business, everyone wants to be in everyone's country. So, we've created this new kind of global, multi-platform competitive landscape where the Reliances are buying a DreamWorks, the Disneys are buying a UTV, everyone's looking at Tencent. Who knows where we're all going to be tomorrow, but it's really going to be a very globally engaged kind of platform. And at the center of this madness, we think that more and more is intellectual property, is IP. And the basis of our business, at least what we're building right now, comes on the premise that there's an old adage in the content business that content is king. And if we look at that as being true, then globally appealing multi-platform content is God. the type of thing that is an Avatar, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Spider-Man, those properties that take you into a place of wonder and appeal to audiences from Boston to Beijing to Bangalore, regardless of where you are, because they take you out of your world into another world. And they can speak to people in numerous platforms and numerous media, but numerous markets as well. And fortunately, I think India has some of the richest stories to be able to do that in the world, and some of the richest creators. So our guiding principle is the next J.K. Rowling, Steven Spielberg, Stan Lee, or Miyazaki is sitting somewhere in a village in this country, ready to come and embrace the world with its stories, and our goal is to give them the platform by which to do that. It's kind of defined, Professor Henry Jenkins, the foremost thinker on transmedia in the world today, has put it quite nicely in a quote that we now live at a moment where every story, image, brand, relationship plays itself out across the maximum number of media platforms, shaped top down by decisions made in corporate boardrooms and bottom up by decisions made in teenagers' bedrooms. And I would just say global in terms of that, but I think that sums it up pretty nicely. And that brings me kind of to where I wanted to kind of engage you guys today and talk about, which is most of my life has been about kind of trying to build a business in what we would call the suicide quadrant. Time after time, when I've gone out there as an entrepreneur trying to raise money, trying to build my business, I've heard one quote that continuously comes after me. And it says, pioneers get shot in the back. And you may hear this quote, you may have heard of this quote. If you're out there and you get kicked down the stairs by VCs many times, you'll probably hear it at one point in your life. But this usually refers to this nebulous area called the suicide quadrant, where you're dealing with an existing market, existing product, no problem. People can understand. They can see a tactical way to go in there. Existing market and existing and new product, even there they can understand. But new market, new product is sort of the unknown area. So for us, building new character entertainment properties in a market of India which hasn't proven that it has created global character entertainment properties for the market of India to bring brought out to the world is essentially living in this space of essential fear and uncertainty. And most of the time, I think 5 years ago, this was a common phrase, pioneers get shot in the back. We'd rather wait and see how other people do, and once the market's established, let's go in. Let's bring a big pile of cash and start figuring out what to do right. But I think that we're starting to see that that doesn't always play out. The last 5 years we've seen so many disruptive startups come in that have really embraced this suicide quadrant area and changed the entire way the market has reacted to them. So, obviously these are some of the international big names, but what's very encouraging is when, just even here, you're seeing so many dynamic startups from India doing the same thing, following the same methodology and going with no fear into this area to try and pioneer something new. And the trepidation is that I think you're also dealing in a market that by a larger context is very capital and risk averse. So you have to not only convince the capital partners that you have big scale and big opportunity here, but you have to be able to kind of do it in a convincing manner that are showing the steps that get you there fast. One of the things that I'm always brought back, I think the great entrepreneur of his day and of the greatest entrepreneur of all time probably is Henry Ford. And he always used to say, if I asked the people what they would have wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I think that sums up a man who lived in the suicide quadrant and wasn't afraid to kind of go and challenge it. But there's two things to think about. One is the ecosystem of how an entrepreneur can dynamically evolve. And then two, really at the heart of it, what makes an entrepreneur an entrepreneur? So how many people, just out of a show of hands, who here is in a startup? Okay, who here is VCs or venture? Who here is money? Okay, right, so we've got a good mix of people here. But for the most of the other people, do you work at startups? Are you guys startup guys? No? Okay. Startup? Right. So I guess the question I would ask you real quick, what do you think makes a great entrepreneur? What makes an entrepreneur entrepreneurial? First thing that comes out of your mouth.
Taking the bold step for the opportunity he's seeing.
Taking the bold step. Does anyone else have a quick thought? Yeah, please.
I work in a startup. I'm not an entrepreneur.
Yeah, but if you're in a startup, you're still you're an entrepreneur within an entrepreneurial organization, right?
So before the bold step comes, not giving a damn.
Not giving a damn. Great way to succinctly put it. Yes. Anyone else? Yeah, please. Passion. Great.
Somebody is always looking to solve problems.
Looking to solve problems. Ah, that's great, because of a curious mind. Right. Yeah, back in the back. Just scream it out. Execution-oriented, you'd say. Right. And anyone else? Inquisitive mind. Yeah, you had something. Imagination. So self-belief. So I think there's so many great answers here. I mean, what I will tell you from what I've found very exciting and interesting is that none of these answers are wrong. I think there's kind of three ingredients that people always say that you need to have a great founding team, right? And one of the things that it keeps coming back to is that investors don't invest on a business plan. They will, but ultimately what they're investing on are three things: the people, the people, the people, right? And if they can't believe you can execute, that you're going to shift, you're going to build it, they're betting on you as an entrepreneur and your team and your ability to kind of grow a team that works in that same fashion. And usually that ingredient can come in one person, three people, many, but it tends to fall into three things that I think are very interesting that they look for. Is one, is the vision there? Is there someone with vision? Is there someone who can sell it? And is there someone who can execute it? And those three are very compelling combinations when put together in the right startup mix. But there's actually a great professor named Sarah Saraswati at the Darden School of Business who's been doing a lot of research into this. And she spent a lot of time studying entrepreneurs and doing analysis of all of them to try and get in their head. And the insights that she had are truly phenomenal. So basically we have all been trained in formal education to be what's called a causal thinker. To think about our life in sort of a Genghis Khan mentality. We have means, we have a goal. How do we use our means and execute the goal? And that's essentially the large way that we approach, and many entrepreneurs approach the entrepreneurship process. We have X amount of means at our disposal. This is what we've got. What's the fastest, most efficient, optimal way to hit those milestones and start achieving those goals? And there's a kind of variation on this where you co-opt and figure out some new means along the way, but you're still focusing on that goal, and you're still focusing on that execution. And what you found is that most of the successful, kind of ultimate billion-dollar exit startups that she examined didn't start that way. They actually started very differently. They started with effectual thinking, which is, to put it in contrast, is a little bit more, you've got your means, but there are many goals that could emerge. You don't know where the land is. You're Christopher Columbus on the boat. You've got enough stuff that you know is there with you. You don't know how long you're going to last. You're going to have to figure it out. You don't know where the land is. And you could land up in the US when you went to go for India, right? So, ultimately it's about emergent goals that start to happen as you start to kind of get in the trenches of building your business with the means that you have at your disposal. And you will co-opt new means, you'll co-opt new customers, you'll co-opt new plans and new partners, but ultimately all the goals that you thought you set out with are going to change. And you're flexible enough to kind of shift and find those emergent new goals. So it's sort of like, what kind of cook are you? Are you the kind of cook that likes to go into a kitchen, be told that you got to make dinner for 50 people tonight, and have a kitchen with all the ingredients and a nice set of recipes, and go and execute? Or are you the kind of person that's told, you got to make dinner for 50 people tonight, there's a kitchen, we don't know what food's in there, but figure it out? And it's sort of where you feel you're best at, where you feel you thrive at. But this is something that's very interesting. So yeah, the causal thinkers and the way we've actually trained our educational system is very much like the great general seeking to conquer the fertile lands. Go out there, use that means that you have, and execute, execute, execute. The effectual thinkers are the explorers setting out to voyages onto uncharted waters, not knowing where the land is or even if there's going to be land at all, and kind of being open to the journey that everything is going to change. Ultimately, the most successful entrepreneurs are capable of both. The life of the startup is that you will need both of these things in your tool chest. Where you start, though, isn't as much as with the spreadsheets and the planning, as much as with the kind of getting on the journey, as many people said, the passion, the kind of innate curiosity, a lot of the qualities that I think set you on the motion that you don't know where the goal is going to be, but the journey is really the fun of it. So while causal reasoning may or may not involve creative thinking, effectual reasoning is all about creative thinking. It's intuitively about salesmanship, imagination, spontaneity. Causal reasoning comes to life through careful planning and subsequent execution, where effectual reasoning lives and breathes execution. Plans are made and unmade and revised almost on a daily basis. They're completely reinventive. So kind of think of it this way: causal thinkers' attitude would be, to the extent we can predict the future, we can control it. The effectual thinker, to the extent that we can control the future, we don't need to predict it. And the logic here again is that their belief, the effectual thinker, is that the market doesn't know what it wants yet. We're going to help shape that market. We're going to help build that market. The future is going to be determined by the stakeholders in here today and how we kind of create that ecosystem for ourselves. It's not there. The future isn't determined and we're not finding a way to it. We're making it happen as we go. And look at Airbnb, look at most of the great things that we've seen, Skype, the whole social community economy that's started to emerge right now in terms of startups, Uber. All of these things created markets where there were no markets to begin with. They created opportunities that people didn't even know there were. So I think we're seeing proof of this over and over right now, and particularly I think in India, where India has a tendency to leapfrog very fast. Their landlines are dead. No one has landlines anymore. We jump straight out of landlines right to cell phones and mobile. And we just go to the latest technology. We jump very quickly in our thinking and in our execution. So I think what we have to be looking at is India is a place that has a dynamic possibility of leapfrogging. And if so, how we shape the future of India is never going to be told to a great entrepreneur, never be told to any of us. I mean, we're looking, on a personal journey, we're looking at a character entertainment space that really is fairly non-existent in India. And we're going to create it. That's the only way we can go about it. So, it's not that it's there and we're taking a market share from it. So I believe that at the end of it, what we find is the greatest strength of the entrepreneur when he's starting any journey or getting into this is comfort with ambiguity. And that kind of sums it up. And I think that we innately, as Indians, are probably we're a little bit more inherently comfortable with ambiguity than other countries in the world too. I think by nature, as the classic old adage, I know China has been very successful in entrepreneurship, but it's been very top-down. And it's been very controlled from a top-down place. And if you look at the kind of old adage of in China things happen because of the government, in India they happen despite the government, I think there's some truth to that, right? That Indians, no matter where they are in the world, find a way to get it done. They go and they figure it out. They move with it. They kind of adapt to it. So I think we innately have an advantage by our philosophy, our underlying thinking, to kind of take advantage of this comfort with ambiguity, but we have to embrace it. And oftentimes I find our classrooms and our educational system in India actually is destroying what innately comes naturally. Professor Saraswati says this very nicely in a quote. In our classrooms, we teach potential entrepreneurs an extremely causal process, the sequential progression from idea to market research, to financial projections, to team, to business plan, to financing, to prototype, to market, to exit. With the caveat, of course, that surprises will happen along the way. But the surprises are not the deviations from the path. They are the path. And that's what we have to start teaching, is that is the journey. That is the ability to be excited about every change is every opportunity. So I think it comes back to, some of the things I've done since I've moved back here and really started trying to dig in is how can I help in some way, kind of give something to this Indian entrepreneurial ecosystem that we want to build out here and meet with young entrepreneurs, try to nurture and build an ecosystem that I think can be very dynamic. And everyone always looks at Silicon Valley and they kind of say, wow, let's build the next Silicon Valley. And I think that Silicon Valley came because of a number of things that happened at the right place, right time, as most things do. And it emerged over many, many years. Now, I think we should take the best things we can from Silicon Valley and we should learn about what is working there and what is the right things. But ultimately, what we need to do is embrace the Indian uniqueness of who we are. I mean, America is a melting pot, India is a thali, right? I mean, we can sit on the same kind of plate, very separated, but all taste great in the same meal. It doesn't need to mix together in the same way. There's a different type of cultural ethos that we can bring to the entrepreneurship ecosystem and start to emerge it. But I think there are some things that we can learn. So, how do we promote a culture to try and promote some creative problem solving and try and help the educational system balance what is a very competitive rote learning process with ultimately the right tools in the tool chest to get us there? Embrace the comfort with ambiguity. I think, it's easy to say this, it's tougher to live it. I think all of us come from a culture where we are taught that, failure is a bad word. I mean, in India, failure is not as accustomed as it is in other parts of the world, and it is kind of a social stigma when you do. So I think we have to try and embrace that risk of failure and everything else. But we also have to respect startups as a worthy occupation. And Bangalore, more than any other city, has really started to do this. I think, Mumbai as well. But, in the mass of India, we can say that I think startups are still, a little bit of the other. In a culture where people still put on their wedding invitations where they work, if you're working at, bigballoon.com, it's not the same as working at Cisco, right? So there's a professional kind of perception that stability comes from big company. And in truth, there's no more stability in a big company working there than there is in working in a startup. You're always trying to build something. You're always going to be judged and valued on the success and failure of what you can execute. There is inherent risk in startups, but we have to promote a culture where it is accepted by an entire family ecosystem. Taking it back, when we tried to hire artists and writers in India to kind of work in the creative space, they were told that their parents, half the parents didn't even want them to do that kind of profession. It wasn't seen as respected. But when we were able to push them up to a level where they were seen, as doing something for a global economy, really changing the perception of India in this way, and finding a way to make salaries that are as competitive as other industries, I think people started to look at it very different. It's starting to change. It's still a long way to go. But I think we have to look at the entire entrepreneurial ecosystem in that way, and we have to say, how do we kind of really come together on it? The other is to embrace your inner anarchist. I often find that, and as I was saying before, when I teach a lot of the students in New York that are kind of coming out and starting startups, what's the motivation that really gets them going is not, it's almost like, will they have fun? It starts with they see a big idea, they see something that they want to tackle, they see a big need, and they see an anarchist way to tear down the established machine. There's a bit of wanting to flip the bird at the machine, to kind of go after it and have some fun in the process that motivates them. Then, before they know it, they've actually got a business on their hands, and they've started to figure out things in a little bit more formal way. Often these guys will work for a lunch, and they'll buy the lunch, right? I mean, they're not there for a job, they're there because of passion. And someone said that very well. I think that innate passion to just want to see something done better and try to be a disruptor in that space is inevitably how many of these entrepreneurial startups get done, and then they start going from there. So I think, I've seen entrepreneurs around the world come at it from two ends. One is a very tactical business model that they've built out, they've planned, they've analyzed it, and they've actually kind of said, if I go and take a job, I will get this much over 5 years. If I go and start a startup, if it all works out, I'll get this much over 5 years. They've actually thought about their life in that kind of very tactical planning way. I think that's very admirable. I don't know if life works out that way. I think the true way to start it is going to be to find your inner passion of what's going to get you up in the morning. What's the thing that's your juice? What are you going to want to do, and what would you pay someone to do? And if that gets you going, then I think you're in good shape, because then you've embraced your anarchist, and you're trying to do something. Yeah, I love this quote. If you try to risk failure, if you try, you risk failure. If you don't, you insure it. And I think it's best to try better to try and fail. But I would say fail honorably. Go big. Do something big. Put your all in it. Leave everything out on the field of the game. If you're going to fail, make sure it was because you never look back and say it was because of any regrets you had that you didn't give everything to it. So someone asked a question in the last session about the 20-hour work week, or could we kind of create some sort of culture of that? I think this is where, in an entrepreneurial startup environment, if you don't love it, if you don't want to give every moment of your life to it, then it's tough to say that, you have given it all and you have tried your best on it. And then I'd say, let's also move, and fail forward means, I think there's a tendency, I think, in some ways to look at this, and it comes back to this scorched earth philosophy. So in emerging markets and certain types of other cultures where you see their entrepreneurial ecosystems are just building, what tends to happen is capital is very risk averse. And so venture capital, entrepreneurs, everyone who's kind of in the ecosystem starts looking at, well, that company failed, and that means that whole idea is dead. And you start looking at it with a lens that starts to be very scary. 5 years, 10 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago. We're living in an ecosystem where 6 months changes the whole game. There is going to be a Friendster before a MySpace, before a Facebook. And what you tend to see in other more developed ecosystems of entrepreneurship, where I think India is now getting very quickly and is that the capital is just jumping ahead. It's saying, okay, they failed. Why did they fail? Let's dissect it, let's postmortem it, let's figure out, does that mean the idea was bad or does it not? But separating the idea from the failure is very important. Separating the execution from the failure is very important. So, beware the scorched earth phenomenon, just to look at something and say they failed. So it's not worth doing. That doesn't mean anything. And I would also encourage everyone to, focus on your strengths, and focus on your strengths, not the other person's weakness. So there is a cultural sensitivity that you often find in a lot of kind of ecosystems, but what Silicon Valley has done extremely well, I find when I talk to entrepreneurs there, is even though they've got 10 competitors, they will talk about why they're better, they will kind of focus on their strengths, but they will never really go at the jugular and trash that guy and say that I would have never put money in that business, that was a disaster, that business is wrong. See, a rising tide lifts all boats. And in a capital-intense market where people are already afraid to put money into VC startups, especially this kind of suicide quadrant startups, leave the other guys to do their thing. They'll succeed and fail if they do. Focus on why you're the best. My best advice is their success is your success is theirs. So we have to build a culture where we are rising all the boats. Let's rejoice when other people have great exits. I look at all the media startup exits that are happening or opportunities that are there in the space, and I think that that's exactly what we want to see happening to build this market up. So I think the other is how do we get more access to capital? And there's 2 points on this that I will bring out. So I think there is a emphasis, we as an ecosystem of entrepreneurs and VCs and creatives and people who are here in this kind of conference today have to place more pressure on the government and try and push kind of more of an ecosystem there. There's 2 areas. One, I think Israel has been very successful in building a very startup-friendly kind of environment very fast. And the reason for that is the government set up a fund of funds called Yazma, $100 million they put to work. They invested that in a number of different funds and essentially gave those other funds the ability to buy them out after a certain period of time at a very easy way. But they put capital into the machine, help mitigate risk on other people's capital, and then kind of boosted up an ecosystem that has continued to thrive to this day, exceedingly more than what they put in. Digital's, we live in the greatest digital kind of hub of India, but yet we live in a very antiquated paperwork process of India. So how do we leapfrog that process, where in Singapore you can start a company in 24 hours and get going, have your payroll and everything else set up, same with the Valley and same with other areas. It can take weeks, if not months, to get these things set up in India. And then once it is set up, you've just started the paper chain. So it is a question of how can we create efficiencies for the entrepreneur. So he is focused on execution, not focused on essentially managing what is the bureaucracy and the paperwork process. And I think this is very easy to fix. It's just a matter of the right lobbying on government, the right ways to kind of do it. And I think we have to, because of just the innate traffic of India, the chaos of infrastructure, the things we have to deal with, we have to encourage digital and virtual operations. Let a person work from home. We can do everything seamlessly on Dropbox, everything seamlessly on Skype. Can we create ecosystems that are completely virtual, recruiting the best talent all across the country, if not the world, and operating in a much more virtual, hands-off way so people don't lose 2.5 hours of their life in a commute every day of the week, right? I'll touch upon this point that one of the things we have to look at as an ecosystem is what measures success. How do we measure success with VCs? How do we measure success when we're in our startups? What are the milestones by which we use? And I think one of the things that I always say is that there is a heavy emphasis on revenues. Of course there is. And are you building scale? But revenues are important, but so is engagement. And I'll give you kind of an example of this. When I talk to a number of VCs in the kind of, and again, I date myself by the media segment VCs, but they're pretty much in every VCs and everything today. One gave me a great example of how they look at the world in terms of startups that they invest in. They said that it's a bullseye model. And at the center of the bullseye is team. Do you have the right team? Is the right people there? Are they going to execute? The second ring out is essentially product and service. What's the product? What's the service? The third ring out is engagement. Have they built an audience that really cares about this, that's engaged, that's active, that's passionate, that they control and have passion around? Fourth is revenue. Fifth is brand. And if you look at where they said the most value they have seen in their portfolio is actually it's in the engagement meets revenue, but it's in the engagement side. Instagram, great example. Huge engagement, very little revenue, was proven to be a success story. Most of the second, third round fundings you've seen in Series A, from Series A to B and C, have literally been in that tipping point where you have proven a significant amount of engagement, not revenue. So we have to be looking at ourselves in an ecosystem today and saying, okay, what is the future of the Indian market and what are we going to value? Because India actually looks very differently at this. They probably look at it team, product, service, and revenue. And engagement is probably very far out there as a distant fourth. And I think that's starting to change. It's starting to change as we're seeing a different kind of ecosystem emerge, and we're starting to see different buyers and investors coming in. So News Hunt, for example, 55 million downloads on the app, really ignited the ebook market for this country. Huge engagement. I can't speak to the revenues at this point, but I can say that engagement in any other country around the world would have led that company to probably a 500 million plus kind of valuation. So we're looking at something that engagement in India is undervalued today, but it is going to switch like a dime. So if you're focusing on your startup, revenues, you're never going to be able to compete with the rest of the world right away. We're all betting on the future of revenues for India. That's going to take time to get there. But I would focus a lot of effort on equally matching engagement, because I do feel that as we look at the international community kind of putting more eyes on India, that is going to have a key deal there. Some of this is pretty obvious stuff. The kind of last point I'll leave you with, because I know I only have 10 minutes, I want to take questions, is there is an Eastern versus Western startup culture, and we've got to kind of start to build our own. So while we talked about some things that work in the Valley and some things we might want to apply here, I'll reflect two stories on this. One is there's a great op-ed writer named David Brooks, and he wrote a study recently where he went and put a bunch of Americans and a bunch of Japanese people in front of a large fish tank. And he asked the Japanese people, what do you see? And all of the Japanese essentially talked about the relationships, the context, how the fish were swimming, what they were doing. Then he asked the Americans, what do you see? And they all pointed to the biggest fish, right? So there was an inherently different way they saw the world from those two cultural ethoses. And where is India? I would have loved to have taken a bunch of Indians and put them there too, because I think it's somewhere in between. It's somewhere different. We believe in individuality, but we are very collaborative by nature. We are very collective by nature. We believe in family and an ethos and a larger sense of society, but we have an individual spark that kind of drives as well. But we have to identify it. We have to start digging deeper into our own journey. The second that I'll give you is, Silicon Valley has created an ecosystem very different than the rest of America. So America's ecosystem is still, in New York City, you'll see it all the time, it's kind of defined by this capitalist culture of what have you made? And it's a very physically kind of driven market. Did you make, where's your cars, where's your money, where's your power, right? It's kind of an ecosystem. What I love about Silicon Valley was probably epitomized to me by, I was out there the day before Facebook went public, and I was at a startup, and I met with the CEO, and I was sitting there with him, and a kid came in, probably in his 20s. I left the room, and the CEO turns to me and says, see that guy? Tomorrow, when Facebook goes public, he'll be worth $10 million. Because he worked at Facebook before here, and he had a lot of shares when he got out of there. But day after tomorrow, he'll still be here at 9 a.m. And I love the story because it epitomized to me, it was not what have you made, it's what have you done. And that's what Silicon Valley stands for, it's what it matters, that's where it is. And I think we have to ask, what is India? What have you made, what have you done, what do you stand for? I think there's something we can evolve as well and think about, but I don't think it's either of those two. I think it's something unique. And these are part of the journeys that we have to go on. I want to play one video for you that kind of inspires me as I think about startups and I think about just the kind of ability we have in our hands to change the world through what we do. And just want to make sure the sound's playing on this. Let's see.
Climate change,
deadly earthquake,
a suicide bomber,
terrorism,
nuclear device in the heart of the nation's capital.
It's no wonder that we're pessimistic. It's no wonder that people think that the world is getting worse. But perhaps that's not the case.
Perhaps we forget that we've only just begun.
Doing what's never been done before is intellectually seductive, whether or not we deem it practical.
What we're seeing is unfathomably new possibilities all of a sudden becoming available to us.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
You have to trust in something. Your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever.
We truly are living in an extraordinary time, and many people forget this.
So now technically your device is on. Can you tell? Can you hear me?
The yearning to do what we do in the service of something larger than ourselves.
Where did we come from? Are we alone in the universe? What is the future of the human race?
When you conduct those exercises, innovation follows just as day follows night.
We can do this. I know we can because we've done it before.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
So I challenge you all to imagine greater, to dream bigger, and to change humanity. Thank you very much. And so I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah, so we'll take any questions if you have them. Yep, go ahead.
I have two questions. First, the causal effect, causal thinking, and the effectual thinking. So causal thinking is for the people who have resources and then they get into what they can do. But for the companies or the startups, they may start with the effectual, then they get into the causal mode, and from there they may again go to the, that cycle can repeat.
So I think that the better way to describe it is that it's a modality of thinking, right? So forget about the means, because both sides will have means. Now, whether you have a lot of means, little means, really doesn't matter. ultimately, a person with means either looks at life and says, there is a clear goal that I'm going to go achieve with these means, and it's now about execution and a very clear set of milestones to reach that goal. The other person says, look, there's going to be many goals that start emerging as I go down this path, so I'm going to keep that open. And I'm starting with these means on this journey, and I'm essentially allowing myself to co-opt new stakeholders, co-opt new means, rediscover new goals, and then start pivoting and shaping the path forward. And at some point, a business grows big enough that, usually I find when it's a publicly traded company, you have to meet quarterly requirements, right? So you're starting to live in a very different mindset of what shareholder expectations are at that point. And at that stage, we've seen many companies, I think that, over history, whether it's Groupon or others, that have been led by people on this journey who are very good, effectual thinkers, and then get to a stage where they're not exactly very good at causal thinking. And so I think you have to ask yourself, play to your strengths is really the question. As any entrepreneur, I think there are these two modes. You can be Genghis Khan or Christopher Columbus. Don't try to be the other if that's not your strength. And if you can wear both hats, wear both. But that's like writing with your right and left hand. So if you have that ability, I think it's fantastic. Steve Jobs had that ability, I think.
The second question I have, you talk about the reforming the education, and you also talked about the comics and like that. So reaching out to the same kind of audience and reviving that kind of education and having that kind of comics or that kind of characters, which makes the textbooks more enriching for the kids.
Oh yeah, and I'm happy to talk about things of that offline. I think, our whole passion is how do we educate kids, one whole side of the business. Obviously we're very entertainment driven, but we are very much using character entertainment and stories to spark imagination for kids. I think that's something that we can solve real big problems with. And can you do me a favor and just hand out some of these to some of the tables for me? So some goodies for all you guys. Please, any other questions? Yeah, please.
When it comes to an effectual...
Yeah. So, this is always the biggest unknown question, and it's sort of it's a dual answer question, right? I think that, and I'm not talking about entrepreneurship. So I'm talking about disruptive entrepreneurship. And what I will caveat that, any guy who goes out there and starts a pizza parlor, any guy who goes out there and starts there's so many levels to entrepreneurship, but disruptive entrepreneurship, I think, there has to be a sense of just going for it and saying that, ultimately, if you are going to shape the market, you want to know quickly how the market is reacting to what you're doing. You want to understand what is the engagement on it, but you're not going to predict your business plan based on that. So you'll shift your business plan. You'll start. So what I'd say is, if you kind of look at, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Eric Rice's The Lean Startup. Great book for anyone I would recommend to read. But I think I'm running out of time too. But ultimately, I think your vision and your goal is not going to change. Your strategies on implementation are going to change based on what you're seeing in the marketplace. And that's what I mean. The goals, vision, I should say vision rather than goal, because I think your goals may be very different as you go out here. And you can look at that as your strategy, your execution, your goals. But your vision of why you started this, your passion that got you up in the morning to get going out there and do it, that's probably not going to change. So I think that market research helps. Steve Jobs, for example, very historically did not use a lot of market research. He did have his team go out there and do market research, but it wasn't to predict how people are going to react to an iPad. It was to predict once the iPad was out, how they could make it better and start to, kind of build up on momentum that they were there. But there was an innate bit of risk that he took, that he was gauging, am I in the right place at the right time? And the internet, Time Warner started a business called Pathfinder, which was the internet 10 years before the internet. It tanked miserably. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on it. But, because it was the wrong place at the wrong time. People weren't ready to do that through their TVs. It was a very different business. So it's a bit of timing, bit of risk, but a lot of, and then once you're in the game and once you're out there, I think you do take market and you do understand what the audience is telling you. I think that's very, very much when you're on the boat, now you got to see everything on there and try and learn everything you can as you start navigating the wheel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question on the engagement and the revenue model you're talking about. So my question is, does it always go hand in hand, or do you think if you focus on engagement first and probably you try to focus on revenue there?
It totally, so here's what I would say. India has to come into its own on this, right? So I would say if you were in the Valley today and you were starting up a startup, if you were going pre-Series A, you're just angel financed, I would say solely focus on product and engagement. Revenues are, some little revenues that are scalable revenues that are focused on percentages may be helpful, but really the story that people are going to be excited by, I believe even in Series A to Series B, the most exciting part of that story is still going to be, is this catching fire? Can we pour jet fuel on this thing and blow it up? And the reason I say India's got to come into its own is because I think that we're still struggling to figure out what India is, right? How much capital are people willing to put in that business? That's a big part of the ecosystem. So in the US, there is a winner-take-all mentality. We're willing to put hundreds of millions of dollars between something that's showing a lot of engagement because there's going to be one Instagram and a lot of other failures. And let's go and everyone is out there for a winner-take-all business. India may not be a winner-take-all mentality. But we certainly know right now it's starting. We've seen a lot of encouraging signs. I think from, obviously, we just saw yesterday from Japan, big amount of investment that's coming into India as well. So there's a lot of money coming in right now, but is it going to be playing in the same space? But I suspect that the international investors that are coming more and more are looking for engagement as much as revenues. If you're going, I've talked to a number of Indian VCs, and I will say the emphasis on revenues is very, very critical to them. And as an entrepreneur, you have to find what is your business and who is that partner you're taking money from? And are you aligned? Because you can't have two guys on that boat rowing in different directions. Otherwise, it's really going to create a lot of problems for you in the long run. Yeah, please.
Hi. So traditionally, India has had a lot of character comics. We had Dhruv and Nagaraj, and at the same time, we had Mandrake and Phantom. So why did these Dhruv and Super Commando Dhruv and Nagaraj not made it to outside shows, but we still had Mandrake?
I think in some ways the risk is, and I grew up reading all those comics. I loved all those comics.
And you
as a
still
kid.
stuck with Hariputtar.
Yeah. Well, look, every kid around the world knows Harry Potter, knows Spider-Man, knows Transformers, knows a lot of these international brands. I think that ultimately it comes down to execution. And our belief is that if we can execute in the level of execution that if a kid today is seeing all those movies, the Avengers and Harry Potter, and seeing, on TV all of the best cartoons from around the world, and you give him something that is inferior in the quality expectations, then you can't blame him for not being as excited. And you can't blame the rest of the world when you're competing in a global competitive property landscape right now. So I do believe that the heart of it, though, is not where the story, is the core of the characters unique and compelling. I think there are a lot of those characters were great. I think the Mahabharata is probably better than Game of Thrones, but it has never been executed in a Lord of the Rings type fashion. And that's what's the game changer. Yeah, please. I'm sorry, what was that? Yeah, the bullseye model, yeah. That is, a classic VC way of, from many VCs I've talked to, correct.
Yeah, that's true. But from the entrepreneur perspective, he may believe in that model, but the ecosystem around him, whether it is the investors, whether there is a government, there is a funding option, or the family pressure. So how do you think that should change in India so that more and more people come into entrepreneurship, do something differently, grow the economy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's going to happen from two types of entrepreneurship that are going to emerge. So one is, essentially a, mass entrepreneurship that starts to happen. And that is going to be more revenue focused, right? That's going to be more, how do I take $10,000 and start a small business? And I think that that's happening with guys, that we're seeing from, the mystery of capital. Hernando de Soto has been talking about that. A lot of people have been talking about how do we unlock that value in India, and it will happen. But then I think there's a question of where I would probably say I would focus my efforts on is this disruptive entrepreneurship that within a year can create 10,000 jobs. And create, great amounts of value in a different way. Neither is going to change the game alone. But that's the area that I think where I would talk about where it's partly, so I talked about engagement. Here's one thing I will say that has to change in the Indian psyche. So I met an Indian investor out in the US, and I remember talking to him. And I was telling him my story and telling him everything we're doing. And he said, and he was a very successful entrepreneur in the West. He'd made probably close to $1 billion, right? He was a really successful guy. And he said, I never invest in companies targeting India or Indian companies, right? Like India for the US, fine, but never invest in Indian companies for the Indian market. And I said, why? And he said, because, and it shocked me, but he said, because Indians don't like to make other Indians rich. And I said, what do you mean by that? And when I dug in, he said, look, if you look at most of the industrial families, the media families, the kind of business ecosystem of India, and look at the rest of the world. The rest of the world, they don't care if it's 15 guys in a startup. If they want that technology, they'll pay $100 million for it. All those guys are rich tomorrow. They don't care. But in India, they'd say, why do we want to pay $100 million? We'll make it. We'll build it. We'll do it ourselves. That's an interesting thing. It's an interesting observation that he made because it makes the ecosystem itself filled with a challenge. If you can't have exits, you can't have access to capital. A lot of new capital doesn't come in unless there's a lot of exits that are happening. It becomes a snake eating its own tail. So you'd be much better off, and what they've learned in a lot of these Western companies, I don't want to waste my time building it. I want to fold it in, unlock value that I can see on that, I'll pay the premium for it, and I want to keep growing. That's a cultural difference. And it's not just here. It's in Europe and other countries we see it as well. So I think this all comes down to just a psychological shift that we have to make where we do see a rising tide lift all boats, where we do see that openness starting to emerge. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going probably too long on that.
Last question.
Yeah, last question.
So I'm sure you're dealing a lot with creative people. We are running a startup, and startup has got to do a lot with creativity. We are solving large problems, and we do get stuck up with small problems. We have ideas to resolve them, but I see a lot of people getting stuck with what we call as creativity block. How do you help people overcome that?
Well, I think there's one issue that we have to focus on in India too, which is that, ultimately I think the schools, the ecosystem, the way that we have been training in our space, there's Bollywood. Bollywood is a completely different segment and obviously does great work in Bollywood. What I'd say in our segment, it has been training students to be technicians and not artists. It has been training them not to think, not to create, but to execute. And again, we are very careful that we want to hire artists very young. We want them to completely take risk. We want them to break the mold, and we want them to go for it. They're not trying to be the best in India. If they're going to create a character, it's going to compete with the world today. So they have to make a property that everyone in the world looks at and says, that's as good as ours. That's better. Because the stigma in India is that it's an outsourcing shop. So to even overcome that stigma, we got to be 10 times better in the first place. So I think first you got to set that kind of ambitious goal, and then I think you've got to let creatives be creative. That's a guiding belief that we have. We let people take risk. We let them tell stories that probably no other studio would have let them tell. And then we try and push it out there, and we'll see what happens. And we manage it through tight operating efficiencies. So I think the secret to the content business is ultimately some things are going to break above others, but you have to manage a very tight operating efficient machine to be able to execute. So thank you. Guys, this was really a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.